On this week's episode of The Science Inside, the WITS Radio Academy look at all things China, from the downgrading of China's economy to learning to speak Mandarin and even Chinese developments and Chinese cities being replicated in Africa. They investigate it all. I'm joined on the line by Elna Schutz. She's from the WITS Radio Academy and she's going to speak to us about this week's episode. Elna, thanks so much for chatting to us.
Of course.
Now, I really loved this week's episode, especially because you start us off by explaining why we're looking at China. And of course, it has everything to do with global markets. Won't you just introduce us to that?
Sure. Well, I always like to think of our show as the kind of thing you want to know before you go to a dinner party, and you can kind of impress everybody with how clued up you are to things. And this week was definitely one of those episodes. So we started off speaking to economist Harvey Wirth, which a lot of our listeners may be familiar with. He's a very well-known economist, and he just kind of explained to us how China's stock market became incredibly popular in the last few years, and ordinary people started buying a lot of stock, and that kind of caused this bubble that eventually had to burst, so to say. So we start just by explaining the basics if you haven't been following the China story.
It's absolutely fascinating. And then you go on to talk a little bit more and investigate Chinese developments that could be popping up around South Africa, specifically in Modderfontein.
It's quite an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people know about, that China has this really big drive at the moment to bring developments, investments, whole cities into Africa. And so they're building these giant developments all over in Nigeria, in Kenya, and South Africa. And it's a big thing. And so there's a big one in Modderfontein, which has just started production, but they want to be housing around 100,000 people in the next 15 years. So they're basically building a city.
Absolutely extraordinary. Now, we know that the Department of Basic Education has recently said that Mandarin will be available in the schools with the capacity to teach it. It's obviously a very good idea. And so one of your reporters went and tried to learn at least the basics of Mandarin. It was a lot of fun to listen to. Tell us about that.
Yes, we sent Litvia into the war zone. We sent her into a Mandarin class, and she kind of felt like a kid again, trying to learn numbers and basic words. And then she just kind of found out a bit more about learning the language, and interestingly, how similar it is in some aspects to English.
And I think
so that's a fun one.
That's what many people don't expect. In fact, there are quite a few similarities between the two languages.
Not so much, I think, linguistically in terms of words, but I think in terms of how the language works around metaphors, around being very culturally charged, I think that does come in a similar way.
What else can listeners expect from this week's episode?
So those are the main things. If you go onto our SoundCloud account, there are always some extra things from the live show. So there is also an interview about how China and South Africa are working together on ICT. So that's communication technology, broadband, internet, how the two countries are working together on that. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And there's also a fun quiz we always do, so you can go and listen there and try to see if you can beat our contestants.
Elna, thank you so much for speaking to us today, and we'll catch up again next week to talk about the next episode of The Science Inside.
Definitely. Thank you so much.